Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 284. Before I introduce this week's guest to you, I wanted to let you know about a very special episode coming up in 2 weeks on December 17th. I've asked our While We're Waiting facilitators to share with me some of their best tips and advice for navigating the Christmas holiday after the death of a child. I've already received a lot of great input from them, and I'm excited to share it with you in a couple of weeks. But in today's episode, I'm talking with my new friend Jenny Leavitt, a pastor's wife and bereaved mom from Central Florida. Jenny and her husband Myron have spent most of their 32 years of marriage in ministry, serving in a community marked by deep need and dependence on Jesus. She's also the author of Godprints, Finding Evidence of God in the Shattered Pieces of Life, and will be weaving that theme all throughout our conversation. Jenny uses the phrase Godprints to describe those unmistakable fingerprints of God we often only recognize when we look back over our stories, even our most painful ones. Today, Jenny shares how a season of battling stage 4 cancer shaped her faith and prepared her family for storms that were to come. She then introduces us to her youngest son, Jacob, a friendly, artistic, Jesus-loving high school senior, and then walks us through the tragic accident caused by a drunk driver that took Jacob's life and left his older brother Caleb fighting for his own. Jenny talks about navigating deep grief while helping Caleb recover from catastrophic injuries and survivor's guilt, and she shares the powerful Godprint Jacob left behind just months before his death. She also speaks honestly about the long, difficult process of forgiveness, forgiving the driver, forgiving themselves, and even forgiving God for the unanswered questions, and offers practical encouragement for newly bereaved parents and couples who grieve in different ways. This is a 2-part conversation, so be sure to come back next week to hear some of Jenny's practical tips for navigating the holidays as we now find ourselves deep in the Christmas season. But for now, just sit back and listen in. Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jill.
Yeah, I have been looking forward to our visit and looking forward to my audience getting to know you. In order to do that, would you take just a minute and tell us a little bit about where you're from and what life is like for you there?
So I live in Florida. Right now, my husband and I live just north of Orlando. I've pretty much lived in Florida all my life. My dad was military, so that brought us down here, and my husband was military. That's what brought him over here. But my husband and I have been married, almost 32 years. It'll be 32 years in December. And we have been in some form of ministry leadership pretty much our entire married life. And as a matter of fact, that's why we made the move 6 or 7 years ago from northern Florida to central Florida, where we're at now for ministry. So we serve in a very desperate community right now that a lot of addictions and low income and everything, but people that when they meet Jesus, they just love him and they're just so grateful. So, I'm also grateful to just be on this journey with my husband.
Yes. Sounds like a very valuable place of service.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, good. Now, you are the author of a book called Godprints, Finding Evidence of God in the Shattered Pieces of Life. And we'll be talking about that kind of throughout our conversation today. But I'd like to know what you mean by the term Godprints.
So, I don't know. Gosh, it was at least 20 years ago, maybe longer. My husband had preached this sermon on recognizing the footprints of Satan in your life. When you can see that it's just, he's something's afoot. And
Yeah.
I remember after our loss, after the accident that took our youngest son, I remember thinking, I want to flip that concept on its head and start looking for all those fingerprints of God, the times that only He could do something like that, times that it was evident that He intervened. And I was actually really surprised when I really sat down to think back over my life. It wasn't just after the accident. There were so many things in my life leading up to the accident that God's fingerprints were all over it. And what He was preparing me, He was preparing my husband, our son, and we just didn't realize it. When you're going through day to day life, you're not even like paying attention to those God print moments sometimes. But
Right.
that's where the title comes from, and I think it's a great way to acknowledge the good in our lives and how God weaves together all those things that the enemy means for to destroy us, that God has been preparing us all along. He continued to show up even after our loss. We could find Him. And I know I'm not alone. I know there are lots of people that after they experience a loss, they can look back and say, oh, we had just had a conversation about that, or somebody just showed up out of the blue, or there are so many different things like that. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm looking forward to hearing about all of the evidence of God prints throughout your story as we talk today. So, we're going to be talking about your son Jacob and his story mostly today. But before we get into that, I'd like for you to start a few years before the accident when you were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Talk about what that was like and how God has used it in your life.
So, our boys were really, really young when I battled stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and had chemotherapy, radiation, lots of surgeries, some scares since then, but I have been clear since November of 1998. So
Wow.
it is pretty, I would even say miraculous that I'm even here. I am in a nationwide database where they study my file because it's rare for someone to survive the way I've survived. And it was a rough go. I talk about it some in the book because there were a lot of times during that season where God was teaching us stuff that we had no idea that we were going to need, but God did.
Right.
And I mean, gosh, my husband lost his job through that time, but we learned that God's a provider. And, there's just so many lessons that we learned through that. And one of the biggest is I remember our boys were really, really young. Like Caleb was 3, and so Jacob would have been a baby. And I remember one of my biggest mind battles going through cancer wasn't myself. I knew that I had accepted Christ as a teenager and, asked Him to forgive me. And I have no doubt that He did. And so I knew that I was right. It was my boys. I was like, oh
Sure.
my gosh, Lord, what is my husband going to do with a 3-year-old and a baby at
Yeah.
home? And I still remember going out in the middle of the night one night when I couldn't sleep and it was just keeping me up. And I was like, God, I'm not leaving this living room until I get some peace about this. I just can't keep battling this mind battle. And I don't know how long I, stayed there praying and just talking to God about all of it, just getting completely honest. But I still remember all these years later, God just comforting me and speaking to me and telling me they were mine before they were yours, Jenny. If I
Mm-hmm.
choose to take you home, I'm going to take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember such a peace that came over me that it was a radical change. Like I just knew that if God took me home, He was going to take care of them. He was going to provide. He was going to give Myron wisdom, whatever it took, because He loved them. And that is one of the biggest God print moments in my early part of my life that I could look back later and hold on to and cling to and say, they were yours. They were yours.
That's right. And at the time, you could not have imagined, I'm sure, how God was going to use that
No.
affirmation that they were His,
Mm-hmm.
and with what was to come later,
Yep. Had
in your
no
lives.
idea.
Right, right.
No idea.
Yeah, but certainly some very good preparation for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to hear about Jacob now. Take a few minutes and tell us about him. Help us get to know him a little bit.
So Caleb is our oldest, and Caleb was born organized. He was our one that would line up his little Hot Wheels cars, and 1 years old, he would be pushing his shoes against the wall, nice, neat. And then Jacob came, and Jacob was our artistic free spirit. Come in from church on Sunday afternoon, and his little tie would be thrown across the room while his dress shoe went the other way, and they were so opposites. It just, it's still funny to think about how opposite they were. But as they grew older, Jacob was also just a super friendly, really outgoing kid. And we knew that about him, but after we lost him, it just was amazing to us how many of his classmates, his whole football team just about came out for his memorial. And there was this one student that came and said when he was new to the school that he always remembered this, that he was in the cafeteria for lunch, sitting off by himself, and Jacob came over and sat down and said, "Hi, I'm Jacob. What's your name?" And that's just the kind of person he was.
Sure.
He would see that person off by themselves and go and introduce himself so that they wouldn't be sitting alone. And he just, in that those last couple months before he passed away the second week of his senior year in high school.
Mm. Wow.
And his over the summer, he had just gone with his youth group to a youth camp and came back really stirred, for Jesus, and wanting to really reach his classmates, with God's love, and had really started praying for them. And that's the kind of kid that he was.
Yeah. Sounds like an amazing young man. I
Yeah.
love that. So talk about what happened in late August of 2015.
So all four of us, my husband and I, and Caleb and Jacob, had been up at our church on a Saturday night doing volunteering in a special event that they had. And my husband and I had just gotten home, and Caleb and Jacob had ridden together in Caleb's little SUV. And to make a long story short, they were hit by a drunk driver. And we found out after several hours of confusion that Jacob had passed away at the scene of the accident. And then Caleb, it was very touch and go for a few weeks there. He had just catastrophic injuries that they didn't know if he was going to survive. And I remember telling God that night in the little room off of the emergency room, "God, you can't take them both. I don't think I
Yeah.
could survive." And there are still times when I hear about families that lose more than one child that, I mean, oh my gosh, my heart just breaks. Like, I remember what it was like losing one. My heart breaks for people that have lost more than one child.
Yeah.
Um, and I just remember being like, "God, please, please spare him." And Caleb is definitely a fighter. He always has been that stubborn, strong-willed one. And I remember Myron and I going in the room, and before they were going to do emergency surgery on Caleb that night, and just telling him, I mean, he was unconscious, but we were like, "Son, you got to fight. You're a fighter. You got to fight this."
Yeah.
And he did. It took him about a year because they were really, really bad from the top of his head down to his feet injuries.
Mm.
But he did, and he had to learn how to walk again. but he did. Thank God he did. And just so you guys know, because this isn't in the book, but he did go on to graduate. He already had his associates when the accident happened, but he is now an elementary school teacher and loves it.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Um, yeah. And then he got married a few years ago and gave us our first grandbaby, which
Wow.
I always tell people that to me, she is proof that God brings beauty from ashes.
Mm.
It is 10 years later, but we have this beautiful little granddaughter that all of us have talked about it. I have no doubt that Jacob would have been such a great uncle
Yeah.
and would have absolutely loved her. And, all of us have talked about it, that we feel like that God has allowed him to see,
Hmm.
that great cloud of witnesses that Hebrews
Sure.
tells us we're surrounded by.
Yeah. So you found yourself in that situation where you were grieving Jacob, and
Yep.
at the same time, you've got this other severely injured child that you are helping to recover from his injuries. Talk about that experience, just the complications of that. Was survivor's guilt an issue for Caleb? How did you work through some of those issues?
Mm. Well, there are pros and cons of me having had a son that needed my full attention.
Sure.
Um, it did give me a reason to get out of bed,
Yeah.
um, you know, and I wanted to see him get well, get healed. I was able to be there for him. So, I mean, that's definitely a lot of the good things that came out of that part. I would say, and I've talked to others that have been in similar circumstances. One of the big drawbacks is it can delay you actually facing reality,
Yes, I
and
wondered
then,
about that.
and then you have to face it. So that's me personally. And then yeah, Caleb, boy, did Caleb battle survivor's guilt.
Mm.
He was not at fault at all. The other driver was drunk, but Caleb was driving. Caleb was the older brother. He doesn't remember any of it, which I've actually found. I don't remember the statistic on it, but it was really high. Most people don't remember a traumatic accident. And I personally think that that's God's grace.
Mm. Sure. Yeah.
So you don't have to relive that over and over again. But especially early on, that was actually really hard for him because he was already battling. Could I have done something differently?
Sure. Yeah.
Anything like that. But he also really, really struggled with anger,
Mm.
anger
Hmm.
at the other driver, anger at
Yeah.
himself, anger at God. And one of the amazing things that God did, which I guess it would be like a GodPrint moment for Caleb, was when one time he just said he went up to the church during the day. It was when he wasn't home, or I'm sorry, he was home. He wasn't released to go back to work or anything yet.
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't remember. I think he was going to like paint a room at the church for our pastor, or something like that. But he was by himself up there, and he went in the sanctuary and said that he just had enough, and just started like railing at God and just like telling God everything that he was mad about. And instead of feeling judgment from just getting so honest with God, he says that he just felt God just calmly speak to his heart. So are you done? Can we move forward now?
Yes, I
And
love that.
and something just broke. I mean, it
Hmm.
it broke so much in his life that people around him were like, "Wow, what's different?" Like your
Mm.
countenance
Hmm.
is even different.
Yeah.
um, of how God just broke that when he finally, got free from that.
Hmm.
And then, all of us, I think, gosh, all three of us, me, my husband, his name is Myron,
Hmm.
um, and Caleb, all of us have had to battle forgiveness,
Right. Yeah.
for the situation. And sometimes I've had people ask me like, well, like, how did you forgive? You know, all three of us had a different path getting there. I don't think it's like something that you can say, well, I did this, this, and this, you know. I think each person has to kind of navigate that journey on their own. But I usually encourage people, if you don't feel like you can, at least talk to God about that and
Yeah.
say something like, I know I need to, Lord. I'm not feeling it right now, but if you can please help me, I want
Right.
to. I know it's the right thing to do. And just start with something simple, you know,
Hmm.
and I know that's all I did. And it was a process. It wasn't like a one and done thing, you know.
Sure.
It was a process working through that.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a freedom that comes, you
Mm.
know, when we do release those that we feel have wronged us. Or in Caleb's case, he also had to forgive himself as being
Hmm.
the older brother and all that he was going through.
Yeah. The forgiving is almost more for you, you think, than for
Yeah.
the perpetrator? Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned that Jacob died at the beginning of his senior year,
hmm
and that meant that you had to walk through all of the senior year activities without him. Graduation and prom and all of those things. Our daughter died in her junior year, and so we know the struggle of that. How did you deal with that?
Well, his school was phenomenal about reaching out and just keeping us in the loop. His principal and the guidance team, they were really good at that. And Jacob had some really good friends that were in his senior class at his school that were also in his youth group.
Mm,
So that was a big blessing as well. But I'm not going to lie, it was very, very hard. And we would still get the flyers in the mail for college recruitment. And, you know, when he turned 18, that he was supposed to register for the armed forces, you know,
yeah,
that all
yeah.
those things still came in the mail. One of the things that really helped was towards the end of his senior year, his principal actually asked my husband. By then we'd gotten to know him pretty well, and he actually asked him to share at the baccalaureate. And so that was, I'm pretty sure that was the first time that Myron publicly spoke about it.
Hmm.
He did a great job. And what we haven't talked about yet was 4 days after the loss, Myron and I were taking turns at the hospital. So one of us was always with Caleb and the other one could
Sure.
go home. And I was at home and I was going through a lot of Jacob's belongings. Some of our dear friends from the church had told us, if you just get together whatever you want at the memorial for Jacob, we will take care of getting it on the tables and
Mm,
getting it set up for you. Just put
so
it
helpful.
aside and tell us where it's at the house and we'll come by and get it. And so I was going through his stuff. And like I said earlier, Jacob was our artistic free spirit type. That means his room reflected that, and it was a
Sure.
mess. Oh my goodness. Him and my husband were always butting heads over that room. And so, I mean, I'm trying to dig through his stuff, and there's piles of papers. And he had a little desk in his room that he would do his homework at. And I had opened the drawer, and there was all kinds of art supplies in there. And he loved to draw and leather tool and paint and woodworking, anything with your hands. He was really good at that, but he was not a writer. So when I found this thing that I thought was a poem, I just figured it was for school. And so I almost put it aside, and something like prompted me to look at it. And before I even read it, I flipped the page, and Jacob loved his name. He used to get in trouble for carving his name on our furniture. Like, he loved his name. And
Wow.
so he had signed his name, Jacob Leavitt, with this flourish on the back page, February 2015. And that's when I was like, okay, wait a minute, this isn't a school thing, or he wouldn't have
Mm,
done that.
right. Yeah.
So I went back and read it, and oh, the his youth pastor still thinks that it was a rap, like a Christian rap,
Hmm.
not a poem. But anyway,
Right.
you look at it. It was called Holding Me, and the whole thing is like Jacob realizing that he's a sinful man and he's wrestling with God and wondering how God could use him. And then he surrenders everything. And the last two verses, he's talking about finally being in the heavenly city, meeting his Savior face to face, dancing on the streets of gold.
Wow.
And I mean, I was just like, oh my gosh, what a treasure.
Yes.
Talk about a God print.
Yes.
And then that he had dated it February 2015, just 6 months before he died.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I know even though my kids were raised in church, after the accident and after we lost Jacob, I was like, God, I've got to know that I'm going to see him again.
Sure.
I want to know that he wasn't just playing church games because he was raised in church. And I like the day, maybe 2 days after that is when I found that poem.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, he wasn't even the writer. We still don't know of anything else that he wrote like that. That's it.
Yeah. Wow.
And I'm convinced that and my mom said this before she passed away. She was like, Jenny, I think God prompted him so that you guys would have a written record of his wrestling with God and surrendering and everything, so you would have that peace. And anyway, so back to the baccalaureate story. My husband, I think they gave him like maybe 10 minutes to share. It wasn't really long, but he shared that poem. And he had a line of Jacob's classmates lined up after the baccalaureate to talk to him.
Wow.
And they were asking questions about what Jacob meant about that poem and how my husband could stand up there and talk about it. And that was one of the first times that we realized that our story could help other people. And, those classmates were hurting just like we were. Unfortunately, Jacob was only the first of several of their classmates that passed away that year.
Wow.
So that they needed the hope,
Absolutely.
and so it just amazes me, even still thinking back. I still keep in touch with some of those old classmates. They'll still reach out to us, and it means so much. As any parent who's lost a child, you always want to know that that their life mattered.
Yeah, that's right. I love that story. What a gift from God for you,
Yep.
and how kind of your husband to share it with that
Yep.
graduating class, and what an impact it made on those
Mhm.
kids.
Yep.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So what is some very practical advice that you would give to a newly bereaved parent, someone that finds herself or himself right at the very beginning of this grief journey?
One of the very first things I always encourage is that they're not alone, because it can feel like nobody else understands just how shattered your heart is. And with that being said, I know early on that brain fog, the grief brain,
Yes.
you're not thinking of connecting with anybody or anything like that. But as soon as you're able to, connect with other people that have experienced grief, it really does make a difference. Even if it's just one person, that can walk that grief journey with you, where you feel like you can trust them, and that it's not going to be judgment or,
Right.
that you're going to have the freedom to just cry if you feel like crying. And then the other thing, I just always encourage people to try to be gracious with themselves and with the people that they live with. We all grieve so differently. Men and women grieve differently. The mom and dads are going to grieve differently than the siblings who lost a sibling.
Right.
It's just all the way around. There's so many different ways that we each grieve, and that we express that grief or don't express that grief. So being gracious with ourselves if we're not handling things the way we think we should have handled them or whatever. Just try to practice grace.
Yes.
It'll make a world of difference when we can try to be compassionate with ourselves and with the people that we live with.
So important. Yes, so important. As we close this first half of my conversation with Jenny Leavitt, we've heard the foundation of her family's story. From her earlier battle with cancer, to Jacob's remarkable life, to the tragic accident that ushered their family into a season of profound grief. Jenny has shared with openness and grace about those early days and the many Godprints she now sees scattered throughout their journey. In next week's episode, we'll go deeper as Jenny talks about how grief has changed for her over the last 10 years, how she and her husband have learned to walk together when their grief looks different, and how they navigate holidays, anniversaries, and tender dates without Jacob. She'll also speak about trusting God in seasons when he feels silent and the hope that continues to sustain her. If this episode encouraged you, I hope you'll share it with another grieving parent who might need to hear Jenny's story. And as always, thank you for joining me for the While We're Waiting podcast, where we trust God together in the midst of our sorrow and look forward with hope to the day we're reunited with our children in heaven.